There are nights that bruise you, nights that crawl under your skin and leave marks that years of healing cannot erase. And for me, the worst of them all was the night the man I loved looked me in the eyes as if I were a stranger and told me that I had nothing left inside me worth staying for. My name is Lily. And on that night, I wasn't just broke. I was emptied, hollowed out by months of struggling to survive, clinging to the hope that love could still anchor me when everything else in my life had collapsed. The apartment was so small, the walls felt as though they were listening, and the flickering light above us made the whole moment feel staged, like my humiliation was being spotlighted for an audience I couldn't see. He stood in the doorway with the certainty of someone who had rehearsed leaving long before he gathered the courage to do it, his hand gripping the luggage we bought together during a year when I still believed we had a future worth investing in. His face was unusually calm, almost relieved, as if shedding me was finally allowing him to breathe again. It wasn't confusion I saw in his eyes. It was boredom, disinterest, the kind of cold detachment people reserve for things they've already mentally thrown away. "I can't do this anymore," he said, each word delivered with such clinical precision that it sliced through me before I could prepare myself. "You have nothing to offer me now, nothing to bring, nothing to build with. I can't keep dragging you through life when you bring absolutely no value to mine." The word value struck me like a slap, as if our years together had been a business transaction he was reviewing, as if my love, loyalty, and sacrifices were failed investments that no longer provided returns. I searched his face for some hint of the man who used to reach for my hand in crowded rooms, who whispered dreams into my hair during nights that felt too fragile to survive. But all I saw was a stranger who had decided I was an inconvenience he was done tolerating. He continued, each sentence slicing deeper, describing my struggles as burdens, my stress as unattractive, my financial problems as dead weight he didn't sign up for. He spoke over the sound of my heart breaking, explaining that he needed someone elevating, someone who added something, someone who wasn't drowning in her own life. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even emotional. He spoke with the ease of someone putting down an item that no longer worked. The betrayal didn't come from the fact that he left. It came from the ease with which he erased everything we had built. It came from the way he walked through the ruins of my life and blamed me for being crushed beneath them. It came from the horrifying clarity that the moment I stopped benefiting him, he stopped loving me. When he turned toward the door, he paused long enough to ensure his final blow landed exactly the way he wanted. "People stay with those who can give them something," he said, as if stating a universal truth. "You just don't have anything left worth staying for." He left without waiting for a response. The door closed with a soft click, but the silence that followed felt like an explosion inside my ribs. I stood there for a long time, unmoving, as if my body needed time to register that someone I once trusted with every fragile part of myself had just walked out with a single brutal justification. I wasn't enough. When my knees finally gave out, I sank to the floor surrounded by overdue bills, job application rejections, and the remnants of a life he once claimed he wanted to build with me. The weight of heartbreak pressed down like something physical, something heavy and suffocating, forcing tears out of me. I didn't even know I still had the strength to cry. I thought of every sacrifice I made, every time I held him together, every moment I poured into us, only to be dismissed like a liability he was clearing from his balance sheet. But somewhere between the waves of agony and the suffocating disbelief, something inside me whispered through the wreckage. A small, fierce voice that refused to die, a voice that sounded like the version of me I forgot existed. At first it was faint, but then it grew louder, steadier, stronger, turning the tears on my cheeks into something sharper than grief. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't revenge. It was awakening. I stood slowly, gripping the edge of the table to steady myself, and looked at the empty doorway where he had walked out so proudly. My hands were still shaking, my heart was still bleeding, but my resolve was solidifying into something unbreakable. He thought I had nothing to offer. He thought I would stay down. He thought walking away was the final chapter of my story. But he didn't know me. Not truly. And my pain, for the first time, began to feel like fuel. That night, with my heart in pieces and my future blurred, I made myself a promise so powerful it felt like the first brick in the foundation of the woman I would become. He would regret ever seeing me as worthless. The morning after he left felt strangely quiet, as if the world had decided to take a step back and watch from a distance while I attempted to assemble the broken pieces of my life with hands that still trembled from the night before. The apartment looked the same, but I didn't. Something inside me had shifted, cracked open, though I didn't yet know whether I had been hollowed out or forced to shed the version of myself I had clung to for far too long. I woke up with swollen eyes and a tight ache in my chest, the kind that makes breathing an uncomfortable negotiation rather than a natural response. And as I sat on the edge of my bed, I realized I had no one to call, nowhere to go, and no comforting voice waiting to soften the blow of heartbreak. Loneliness wasn't just an emotional state, it was a presence, sitting beside me, heavy and uninvited. The bills on the coffee table felt like silent judges, their envelopes stacked in a leaning tower of failure I had tried to avoid for weeks. Rent overdue, utilities overdue. Debt collectors reminding me of obligations I had stopped acknowledging because life had become too chaotic to manage. My bank account held only disappointment. My refrigerator offered little more than a bottle of water and half a loaf of bread, and my heart, still bruised from last night, felt too fragile to carry the weight of everything collapsing around me. I moved through the room like a ghost inhabiting someone else's life, touching objects that no longer felt like mine, walking across floors that felt cold in ways I couldn't explain. I had never felt so abandoned, not even as a child when my mother worked double shifts and forgot school recitals, because at least back then I could pretend she was busy, not indifferent. Now, I couldn't pretend anything. Friends who once promised to always be there had slowly drifted away when my life became inconvenient. Co-workers who used to check on me stopped reaching out the moment my job disappeared. Even neighbors who nodded politely in the hallway no longer made eye contact, as if heartbreak were contagious and poverty something they didn't want to accidentally catch. I felt invisible, like the world had quietly removed me from the list of people worth noticing. Still, I forced myself to turn on my old laptop, its screen flickering as though reluctant to wake, and began searching for jobs, any jobs, that might keep me from drowning completely. I sent applications to office positions, retail stores, remote administrative roles, even cleaning jobs I had never considered before. Each time I clicked submit, I felt a tiny flicker of hope, a fragile spark that maybe someone, somewhere, might see something in me worth giving a chance. But the rejections came quickly, sometimes within minutes, automated messages filled with polite dismissals that felt like carefully wrapped insults. We have decided to move forward with other candidates. Your profile does not match our needs at this time. We regret to inform you. The emails piled up like a second stack of bills, evidence of my diminishing worth. Days blurred together as I repeated the routine, applying, hoping, being rejected, and then applying again until my motivation felt stretched thin like a thread about to snap. I tried to convince myself that this was temporary, that every journey toward rebuilding had to pass through a phase of hopelessness, but even my attempts at optimism felt artificial, like I was practicing lines for a script no one was watching. It was during one of those long afternoons, when exhaustion pressed down on me like a physical weight, that I found myself sitting at a small cafe not far from my apartment. I had gone there not to treat myself, because I no longer had the luxury to do so, but to escape the suffocating silence of my home. I bought the cheapest coffee on the menu and sat near the window, watching people walk by with purpose and direction, feeling like an outsider observing a world that had forgotten I existed. That's when I met her. She was an older woman with silver hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing a burgundy sweater that gave her an air of quiet wisdom. She sat at the table next to mine, glancing occasionally at the stack of resumes scattered in front of me. I noticed her eyes linger longer than a polite stranger should, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried a warmth I hadn't felt from anyone in a long time. "You seem determined," she said, her gaze steady yet gentle. "Most people give up long before they reach that look." I blinked, unsure whether she was mocking me or genuinely offering kindness. "I'm trying," I replied softly, unsure how much of my life to reveal to someone I didn't know. "It feels like nothing is working." She smiled. An empathetic curve, not a pitying one. Things don't work until they do. And sometimes life waits for the moment you're strong enough to handle what it's about to give you. There was something about her presence that disarmed me, something that made me feel seen rather than judged. She asked about my goals, my skills, my background, and as I answered, her interest didn't waver. She listened in a way that made me feel as though my words mattered. I didn't realize how desperately I needed that until the warmth of it wrapped around me like a fragile comfort. When she finally stood to leave, she placed a small business card on my table. Simple, elegant, with her name printed in gold. "You have potential," she said, looking at me as though she already knew a version of me I had yet to become. "I'm looking for people who don't quit easily. Call me tomorrow morning. I think I might have something for you." I stared at the card long after she walked away, my heart pounding with a familiar sense of disbelief. And for the first time since he left, hope didn't feel like a lie. I picked up the card with trembling fingers, because tomorrow morning I might be stepping into an opportunity that could rewrite my entire future. When I called the number on the card the next morning, my hands shook so badly I had to steady them against the edge of my kitchen counter, because part of me still believed the offer might disappear the moment I reached for it. But the older woman, whose name I quickly learned was Margaret, answered with the same warm steadiness she carried in the cafe. And before I knew it, she had invited me to meet her at an office that didn't exist on any job board I had searched. I arrived at a sleek building with wide glass windows, feeling as though I had stepped into a world that didn't belong to me, and for a moment I hesitated at the entrance, wondering if I should turn around and run back to the mess I knew how to navigate. But Margaret met me in the lobby with a smile that felt like sunlight on a cold day, and she guided me into a workspace filled with people who moved with purpose. Designers sketching concepts on digital tablets, marketers discussing strategies over whiteboards, assistants sorting through campaigns that looked nothing like the monotonous corporate paperwork I used to file. She explained that her company focused on branding, creative development, and personal transformation for entrepreneurs building new businesses. It was a world overflowing with color, innovation, and ambition, the complete opposite of the bleak, repetitive jobs I had been applying for. "I don't expect you to know any of this yet," she said, ushering me toward a small desk near the window. "But I can teach you everything. What I need is someone who refuses to break when life tries to bend them." The words hit me harder than I expected. No one had described me that way before. No one had looked past the surface of my struggle to see resilience instead of failure. As she handed me a welcome packet filled with schedules, training modules, and upcoming project notes, something inside me began unclenching. An unfamiliar feeling of possibility stretching through the parts of me that had been numb for so long. The first weeks were overwhelming. I felt like a beginner in a world made for experts, fumbling through tasks I had never attempted before. drafting social media copy, studying branding psychology, learning design basics, and assisting with marketing research that required more creativity than I believed I possessed. I stayed late nearly every evening, studying online tutorials, practicing the skills Margaret insisted I would grow into, and forcing my brain to stretch in directions it had never gone. There were moments I wanted to give up, nights when I stared at my computer screen until my vision blurred, mornings when exhaustion dragged at my body like a physical weight, and afternoons when mistakes made me feel like the same inadequate woman he had accused me of being. But Margaret never flinched at my failures. She pushed me, guided me, corrected me, and celebrated the smallest improvements as though they were milestones. "You're not rebuilding," she told me one night when she found me hunched over my laptop long after closing hours. "You're becoming. Becoming is harder. Becoming takes courage." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, courage began blooming inside me. By the second month, I could create clean digital mock-ups without triple-checking every button. I could write polished descriptions that made clients smile instead of frown. I learned to speak up during meetings, offering ideas I would have once swallowed out of fear they weren't worthy. There was a new steadiness in my posture, a new spark in my voice, and sometimes, when I caught my reflection in the glass walls, I didn't see the broken girl he left. Behind, I saw someone climbing her way out of the wreckage. The transformation wasn't instant. It wasn't even graceful. But it was real. And with every small victory, every client compliment, every successful project submission, every moment Margaret trusted me with something bigger than the last, I felt myself rising. The woman I had been months earlier would have collapsed under the pressure. The woman I was becoming stood straighter each day, fueled by the fire he unintentionally ignited. Then came the day Margaret walked into my cubicle with a smile that could only mean trouble or opportunity, and when she placed a folder on my desk, I realized it was the latter. "It's time," she said simply. "I want you to lead a project." My heartbeat stumbled. "Lead? As in, alone?" "As in, I trust you," she replied. "And you're ready." The project was for a rising clothing startup, a brand built around empowerment and rebirth. Ironic, considering I was quietly living the same story. I threw myself into it with everything I had, researching target audiences, developing mood boards, crafting messaging lines, coordinating with designers, and building strategies late into the evening. It was the first time in years I felt excitement instead of dread while working. And when the startup founder reviewed my final pitch deck, her eyes widened with the kind of wonder I had never inspired in anyone before. "This is brilliant," she whispered. "You're brilliant." The praise echoed in my mind long after she said it, reshaping the way I saw myself in ways no mirror ever had. And then, just when I was beginning to step fully into the woman I was becoming, the past reached out its hand and brushed against my new life. It happened unexpectedly, in the middle of presenting final campaign materials to Margaret's executive team. The conference room door opened quietly, and a voice I hadn't heard since the night my world collapsed carried through the air with a familiarity that made my chest freeze. Someone from my past, someone I never wanted to see again, stood there watching me with stunned disbelief in his eyes. He recognized me instantly, but it was the way he reacted to who I had become that changed everything. The days that followed the unexpected encounter in the conference room became a strange blend of momentum and emotional unraveling, because even though the sight of him standing there had jolted something inside me, I refused to let that split-second shock unravel everything I had worked so hard to rebuild. I buried myself in the project I had been entrusted with, polishing every detail until the strategy shimmered with clarity, refining the visuals until they pulsed with energy, and strengthening the narrative until it echoed with the confidence I was only just learning to claim. For the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I was following someone else's script. I was writing my own, word by word, skill by skill, hour by hour, until I no longer recognized the timid version of myself who once hesitated to even speak in a meeting. Clients began requesting me by name. Designers asked for my input before finalizing layouts. The marketing team invited me to brainstorm sessions that once felt far too advanced for someone at my level. Margaret watched it all quietly, a soft pride humming in her expression whenever she passed my desk, and although she never said it outright, I could feel her trust in me growing like a protective shield around my confidence. When she finally called me into her office, a warm, plant-filled space that smelled like lavender and old books, I thought she wanted to discuss the latest campaign, but instead she handed me a letter with my name printed elegantly across the top. "I'm promoting you," she said simply, as if promotions were as normal as breathing and not life-altering moments that could change everything for someone like me. "Your work has transformed our clients' brands. Your leadership is growing faster than you realize, and your dedication deserves recognition." I stared at her, the words taking a moment to pierce through the disbelief that had carved itself into my bones over the last year. A promotion. For me, the woman who once couldn't afford groceries. The woman who cried on the bathroom floor after being told she had nothing left to offer. The woman he walked away from without a second glance. Now, here I was, holding proof that I was not only capable but exceptional, proof that someone finally saw my value without needing me to bleed for it. As the new title settled into my identity, something unexpected began to soften within me. The past, once a heavy shadow clinging to every part of my mind, began to lose its grip. It didn't disappear entirely, no trauma ever does, but it loosened like a chain that had finally rusted enough to break. Some nights, when the office lights dimmed and the building hummed with quiet electricity, I found myself thinking of him not with bitterness, but with a kind of emotional distance that surprised me. I didn't hate him. I didn't miss him. I simply no longer needed him to define anything about me. Margaret quickly became the stabilizing force I didn't know I had been missing for most of my life. She mentored me with a balance of gentle guidance and unwavering expectations, pushing me to rise higher without ever making me feel like I was drowning. She listened when I shared ideas, challenged me when I doubted myself, and reminded me, again and again, that people don't become strong because life is kind. They become strong because they refuse to let hardship define their worth. In her presence, I didn't feel small. I felt seen. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of myself I once believed were gone forever. I started going for morning walks, letting the air clear the heaviness that used to sit permanently in my chest. I bought groceries, without counting every dollar twice. I smiled more, slept better, spoke louder. Confidence wasn't something I put on. It became something I lived in, something that grew from the quiet knowledge that I was building a life bigger than the ruins I had crawled out of. And just when I thought the past had lost its power over me, fate proved it wasn't done testing my resolve. It happened on a Friday evening during a networking event Margaret insisted I attend. The office had been transformed with soft lighting, elegant decor, and tables filled with clients, entrepreneurs, and industry leaders. I walked in wearing a deep emerald dress that hugged the new strength in my posture. My hair swept gracefully to one side, my confidence radiating in a way that made people turn their heads before I even reached them. I was speaking with a small group of founders when someone across the room moved into my peripheral vision. Familiar shape, familiar frame, familiar presence that once felt like home, but now felt like a ghost brushing past my shoulder. My breath stilled. He was there. Not the same way I remembered him, though. His face carried stress lines I never used to notice, his posture a little stiffer, his eyes scanning the room with a hunger he used to hide behind arrogance. But when he looked directly at me, really looked, something in his expression faltered. He didn't recognize me. Not the woman I used to be. Not the woman he walked away from. Not the woman he dismissed as worthless. Because that woman no longer existed. And the shock in his eyes, as he tried to place me, told me everything I needed to know. He stared at me with dawning confusion, searching my face for a memory he no longer deserved, because the woman standing before him was unrecognizable to the man who left her behind. Success, I learned, doesn't arrive quietly. It doesn't slip into your life with soft footsteps or gentle warmth. It storms in like a flood, carrying both light and shadows in equal measure. The promotion that once felt like a blooming miracle quickly revealed its thorns, and while I rose higher in the company, a place I had once stepped into trembling with uncertainty, I soon discovered that being seen came with its own kind of burden. People who once overlooked me now watched everything I did with sharp curiosity, and those who used to dismiss me with patronizing smiles suddenly saw me as competition. The halls I once walked through invisibly now echoed with whispers I wasn't meant to hear. And for the first time, I understood that success was not a shield, but a battleground. The jealousy came first, subtle, slippery, disguised as politeness. Co-workers who had barely noticed my existence began treating me with a strained cordiality that felt colder than outright hostility. They questioned decisions I made in meetings, challenged suggestions that would have been accepted easily had they come from anyone else, and whispered about how fast I had risen, as though hard work and sleepless nights were somehow unfair advantages. I could feel the resentment simmering beneath their smiles, a silent accusation that I had stepped into a world I did not deserve, as though success only belonged to people born without scars. Then came the sabotage. Small at first, almost unnoticeable. A file mysteriously misplaced, a presentation slide deleted, a crucial email conveniently not forwarded. Each incident felt like a thread pulling loose at the edges of my progress, threatening to unravel everything I had built. But when I brought the issues to Margaret, hoping for clarity or guidance, she simply leaned back in her chair, eyes knowing and steady, and said, "Success shows you who people really are. Don't let them rewrite your worth just because they're uncomfortable with your growth." Her words steadied me, but the emotional conflict inside me grew heavier by the day. I could feel myself changing, becoming sharper, more guarded, less willing to offer grace where cruelty lurked beneath the surface. There were nights I stared at my reflection and wondered if I was becoming the kind of woman I once feared. Someone hardened by success. Someone who built walls instead of bridges. Someone who protected herself so fiercely that she forgot how to breathe freely without armor. I didn't want to lose the softness that had carried me through my darkest moments. Yet I couldn't deny the strength that was slowly replacing the fragility he had left behind. The deeper I stepped into my new role, the more I realized that rising wasn't just about climbing higher. It was about learning who you are when the world tries to push you back down. Some days I navigated the challenges with confidence that surprised even me. Other days I felt like I was balancing on the edge of a cliff, terrified that one misstep would send me tumbling back into the shadows I had fought so hard to escape. But despite the chaos, there was power in knowing I had built something no one could take from me. Not the jealous co-workers, not the silent doubters, not even the ghosts of my past. And yet, even as I fought new battles in the present, the past refused to vanish as easily as I hoped. In quiet moments, when the office lights dimmed and the world softened into a haze of evening glow, I felt the ghosts of old wounds stirring, the memory of his voice telling me I had nothing to offer, the echo of his footsteps walking away from me, the shadow of the woman I used to be standing just behind me, reminding me of everything I had survived. I tried to push those thoughts aside, reminding myself that the past had no power unless I handed it the key. But healing isn't linear, and no matter how high I climbed, a part of me still remembered what it felt like to be left at the bottom. It was during one of those long evenings, when I stayed late finalizing a major pitch, the office nearly empty, the silence thick enough to hear my own heartbeat, that everything took an unexpected turn. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples, trying to fight the fatigue tugging at my eyelids, when my phone buzzed softly beside my laptop. I reached for it absently, expecting a reminder or a notification. But the moment I saw the name on the screen, my breath froze mid-air. A name I hadn't seen in months. A name that once held my heart and shattered it with equal force. A name I promised myself would never have access to me again. My ex. Reaching out for the first time. The message sat there on the screen. Simple, innocent, devastating. And as I stared at it, the world I had rebuilt so carefully began to tremble at the edges. For a long moment I simply stared at the glowing screen, unable to breathe, unable to blink, unable to decide whether the tightness coiling inside my chest was shock or anger or the ghost of a heartbreak that refused to die quietly. His name, so familiar it felt carved into the deepest corners of my memory, lit up my phone with a softness that mocked the brutality with which he had once left my life. I told myself I was stronger now, told myself his absence had become nothing more than a distant echo, told myself the woman reading that message was not the same woman he had abandoned, like she was an inconvenience he had outgrown. Yet something inside me trembled in a way I hated, in a way that reminded me that healing can be powerful and fragile at the same time. The message was simple, almost painfully understated, as though he believed he could tiptoe back into my life without disturbing the ruins he had left behind. "Hey, I've been thinking about you. Can we talk?" The words should have meant nothing. Instead, they peeled at scars I thought had finally hardened, sending a slow ache spreading through my chest with unwelcome familiarity. I sat frozen at my desk, listening to the hum of the building's air system, the soft buzz of distant lights, the muted sounds of a world that continued moving even as mine paused, caught between past and present like a breath stuck in my throat. Minutes passed before I typed a reply, my fingers moving with the heaviness of someone reopening a door they swore they had sealed shut. I didn't say much, just a short acknowledgement, a cautious acceptance to hear what he needed to say. But even that small piece of vulnerability felt like stepping barefoot into a room filled with broken glass. I told myself I was only curious, that closure was sometimes necessary, that hearing him speak could finally silence whatever lingering questions remained inside me. Yet deep down, I knew I was stepping into dangerous emotional territory, a terrain shaped by memories I had spent months trying not to revisit. His response came almost instantly, as though he had been waiting for me with a breath held too long. He apologized first, an apology wrapped in soft phrases, careful tone, and self-reflection that felt rehearsed, yet strangely earnest at the same time. He said he had been wrong to leave me the way he did, wrong to judge my worth by the circumstances I was trapped in, wrong to assume that love was only valuable when paired with stability or success. He said he had been immature, selfish, scared of the future, scared of committing to someone who wasn't perfect, and scared of becoming a man capable of hurting the only woman who ever cared for him without conditions. But then he said something that made my heart twist in ways I didn't want to admit. "I miss you." It was unsettling how easily 3 words could resurrect emotions I thought I had buried deep enough to never feel again. I hated that his voice still echoed in the darkest parts of my heart. Hated that the past still knew how to reach for me. Hated that part of me wondered, just for a fraction of a second, what might have been different if he had said these things months ago, instead of choosing the path that left me alone, terrified and convinced I wasn't enough. As I sat there absorbing the weight of his confession, the room seemed to grow quieter, as if time itself leaned in to listen. I reminded myself that listening didn't mean forgiving, that curiosity wasn't the same as trust, and that closure didn't require reopening a wound. Yet my hands trembled slightly as I agreed to meet him, not out of longing or hope or the old desperate love that once blinded me completely, but out of a desire to finally face the ghost that had haunted every step of my transformation. I wanted answers. I wanted clarity. I wanted to look him in the eyes and see whether the remorse in his messages lived truthfully in his heart, or was simply a well-crafted attempt to reclaim something he never deserved. We chose a quiet cafe, a place with soft lighting and slow music, far away from the noise of our shared past. When I arrived, he was already sitting at a small corner table, looking older somehow, almost humbled, his posture tense in a way that revealed more than any words ever could. For a moment, I simply stood there watching him, feeling a strange mix of nostalgia and detachment swirling inside me, as though I were looking at a photograph of a life I no longer belonged to. When he finally noticed me, he stood quickly, his eyes widening with something resembling awe, maybe even regret, as though he hadn't expected me to walk in looking like the woman I had become. Stronger, steadier, sharper around the edges, yet softer where it mattered most. His voice shook slightly when he spoke my name, as though he were tasting a memory he feared might slip away again. We talked for a long time, about the past, about our pain, about the mistakes that had shaped us both. He apologized again, more sincerely this time, without excuses or self-defense, and although his words were gentle, something in them carried a weight heavy enough to stir old emotions from their resting place. But nothing prepared me for what came next. He reached across the table, looked directly into my eyes, and said quietly, "I want another chance. With you." For hours after our meeting, his words clung to me like fog, soft, lingering, deceptively gentle. Yet something about the way he watched me, the way he chose each sentence with careful precision, the way his hands trembled only when he feared I might walk away. Something in it all felt slightly off. Not false, not entirely manipulative, but hollow in places, as if a part of the truth had been scraped out and hidden behind the version of himself he wanted me to see. I tried to brush the feeling away, tried to tell myself this discomfort was nothing more than the echo of old wounds warning me to stay alert. But the unease settled deeper each time I replayed our conversation in my mind. By the next morning, the doubts were no longer whispers. They were sharp, insistent knocks inside my chest, demanding to be acknowledged. I walked into my office, the sun casting thin lines of gold across my desk, and opened the email I had been avoiding since last night. A notification about a corporate event I would be attending next week. My name was printed clearly among the list of rising entrepreneurs, a category I had never imagined belonging to when he last saw me broken and struggling to survive. It was strange how life had turned so sharply in my favor, how the world that once rejected me now recognized my name, my work, my potential. And that was when the numb realization hit me. He knew. Of course he did. My growth hadn't been quiet. The articles, the interviews, the features highlighting my journey from nothing to a respected name in my field. He must have seen them all. He must have watched from a distance as I built the life he once insisted I could never have without him. The timing of his return felt too precise, too clean, too perfectly aligned with the upward trajectory of my career to be coincidence. My stomach tightened as the pieces shifted into place with a kind of cold clarity that made the room feel strangely smaller. I didn't want to believe it. I didn't want to think he had come back because he saw something valuable in my success, rather than something meaningful in me. But the truth has a way of rising through the cracks of denial, and by noon, the truth became impossible to ignore. It happened while I was walking through the lobby of the building where my small team worked. I overheard two women from the finance department discussing a familiar name, his name. At first I assumed it was coincidence that they were referring to someone else, but when one of them mentioned a failing investment company in his family, my entire world slowed to a painful crawl. My breath caught in my throat as they continued speaking, unaware of my presence. Rumors of significant financial decline, sudden debts linked to a failed expansion, internal turmoil. His name appearing in industry reports about companies, struggling to stay afloat. It felt like being splashed with icy water. He hadn't returned because he missed me. He hadn't returned because he finally understood my worth. He hadn't returned because he grew, or healed, or suddenly learned to love better. He had returned because he had nothing. And I had become someone. A sickening wave of betrayal washed over me, heavier than anything I had felt the night he walked away. Back then, he left because I had nothing to offer. Now he was crawling back because I had everything he once dismissed. The irony was so brutal it almost made me laugh, except the pain pressing against my ribs made it impossible. I went home early, unable to breathe inside an office filled with recognition when the truth of his intentions felt like a dagger twisting slowly inside my chest. As I sat alone in my living room, staring at the polished floor he would have once mocked for being too simple, flashbacks flooded me. Every insult, every moment he made me feel small, every night he chose to leave me drowning while he walked away untouched. And now he wanted another chance? Now he had the courage to apologize? Now he was suddenly full of sincerity and regret? No. Something deeper was hiding behind his return, and I refused to ignore it. That night, I opened my laptop and began searching. Each article, report, and financial update tightened the knot of dread in my stomach. It was all true. He was falling, financially, emotionally, professionally. His company's stock had plummeted. Investors were pulling out. Rumors suggested members of his own board were urging him to step down. His world was crumbling. And suddenly, my world made perfect sense. He didn't come back because I was the one who changed. He came back because his circumstances did. By the time morning came, the anger inside me had hardened into something fierce, something steady, something ready to confront the truth he hadn't intended for me to find. I messaged him to meet. He arrived looking hopeful, almost relieved, as though he believed our story was shifting in his favor. But the moment he saw my expression, the relief drained from his face, replaced by uncertainty. I didn't waste time. I didn't soften my tone. I didn't protect his feelings the way I once would have. I looked him directly in the eyes and asked the question that sliced the air between us open. Tell me the truth. Did you come back because you missed me, or because you lost everything? There are certain mornings when the world looks so different that it almost feels like waking up inside someone else's life. And as I stood by my apartment window watching the city stretch awake beneath a pale sunrise, I realized that something inside me had shifted so profoundly that even my own reflection felt like meeting a stranger I was only beginning to understand. For years, I had been defined by the shadows of the man who walked away, defined by the echoes of his words, by the hollowness of his absence, by the belief that I could never rise unless he chose to lift me. And yet here I was, standing tall, steady, breathing in the sharp clarity of independence that had taken root in me quietly, steadily, fiercely. It wasn't just that I had changed. It was that I had grown into someone he would never have recognized because he never bothered to look deeply enough to see who I could become. As I moved through my morning routine, the memories of the past drifted in, not as wounds but as reminders of the journey that carved me into the woman I was becoming. I remembered the nights I cried myself to sleep in small, suffocating apartments, believing no one would ever choose me. I remembered the days when I stared at job rejections until the words blurred into something that felt like a personal condemnation. I remembered standing in grocery aisles counting coins, pretending I was choosing carefully instead of choosing what I could afford. I remembered how he once looked at me with a mixture of pity and condescension, telling me, without saying it outright, that I would never become anything more than a burden he didn't want to carry. And yet, the woman staring back at me in the mirror now was not that girl anymore. My shoulders no longer slumped beneath the weight of someone else's judgment. My eyes no longer searched for validation in someone who had none to offer. My voice no longer trembled when I spoke my truth. I had rebuilt myself quietly, piece by piece, in the spaces he left empty, learning how to stand alone without leaning on hope that was never meant for me. As I walked into my office later that day, I felt the strength of everything I had earned swirling around me like invisible armor. My team greeted me with the kind of respect I once thought belonged only to people born under better stars. Projects that once intimidated me now felt like challenges I could dissect and conquer. People sought my advice not because they pitied me, but because my voice had finally found its authority. Every achievement was a small victory carved from the ruins he left behind. In moments like that, I couldn't help but remember the version of me he tried to break. The quiet, hesitant girl who dimmed her own brightness so it wouldn't threaten his ego. The girl who apologized for existing every time he grew cold. The girl who mistook breadcrumbs for devotion and silence for patience. I used to think strength meant holding on even when it hurt, but life had forced me to learn that real strength sometimes meant letting go of the people who taught you to suffer. During lunch, I found myself scrolling through old messages I had once been too afraid to delete, reading his empty promises, his false apologies, his calculated affection that only appeared when he feared losing control. For the first time, I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, not longing, just stillness. The kind of stillness that comes only when you finally accept that the version of you who loved the wrong person doesn't exist anymore. Later in the afternoon, while preparing a presentation, I caught a glimpse of myself in the conference room glass and realized that the woman in the reflection carried none of the fragility he once used to manipulate me. I had found direction. I had found ambition. I had found a life that didn't revolve around waiting for someone else's approval. My dreams were no longer tied to his presence, and my worth was no longer shackled to his validation. For the first time, I truly understood what independence felt like. Not the kind that comes from financial stability alone, but the kind that comes from emotional liberation, from the knowledge that I no longer needed someone who had once positioned himself as the measure of my value. That evening, as I left the office, the city hummed with its usual noise, lights flickering against glass buildings like restless stars. I walked slowly, soaking in the life I had built. One decision, one heartbreak, one victory at a time. My heart felt strangely light, as if releasing him had created space for something unexpected to find its way in. And that was when it happened. As I stepped into the lobby of my building, I noticed someone standing near the elevator. A man I had never seen before, dressed in a well-tailored suit that didn't scream wealth, but suggested quiet confidence, the kind of confidence earned through experience rather than entitlement. He lifted his eyes when he heard my footsteps, and there was something in his expression, something curious, grounded, warm, that reached me in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. He smiled politely, stepping aside to let me enter the elevator first. But there was something else in his gaze. Recognition, interest, possibility. And for the first time since he left me with nothing, I felt something stirring inside me that had nothing to do with my past. Something new. As the elevator doors closed slowly, the stranger said my name, softly, as if he had been waiting to meet me for a long time. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the sound of his voice, warm, steady, and spoken with a softness that felt almost foreign after spending years with someone who only spoke to me in tones sharpened by ego and entitlement. When the elevator doors closed, and the stranger said my name as though it carried weight, as though he had been waiting to speak it, something inside me shifted with a quiet tremor that felt neither frightening nor overwhelming, but strangely grounding. It had been so long since a man had spoken to me without expectation, without judgment, without the lingering arrogance that always made me feel like I owed him something simply for existing beside him. The next morning, when I stepped into the lobby on my way to work, he was there again. The same calm presence, the same composed posture, the same expression that suggested he wasn't trying to impress me but genuinely wanted to know me. He introduced himself properly this time. His name was Ethan. His voice held that steady confidence of someone who didn't need to prove anything, someone who stood firmly on his own foundation rather than leaning on others to feel taller. And as strange as it felt, I didn't sense danger or caution in his presence. I sensed patience. Over the next several days, our paths continued crossing, not in forced, uncomfortable ways, but in the natural rhythm of two people who moved through life in the same spaces. Sometimes it was in the elevator, sometimes in the lobby, sometimes outside the building while waiting for a ride. Each brief encounter felt like a small window opening in a room I never realized had been starved of fresh air for too long. Ethan didn't ask about my past, didn't pry into the wounds I carried, didn't try to impress me with grand stories about success or wealth. Instead, he listened when I spoke, asked about my work with genuine curiosity, and held conversations that didn't revolve around ego or performance. His presence was quiet, but it filled the space with the kind of warmth that didn't ask for anything in return. One afternoon, when he happened to run into me outside the office, he noticed the exhaustion in my posture. The kind of exhaustion that comes from emotional battles rather than professional workload. Instead of telling me to smile or sending empty encouragement, he simply said, "If you ever need someone to talk to, not to fix anything, but just to listen, I'm here." And for a moment, the sincerity in his tone struck me harder than any romantic gesture ever could have. It was the first time in my adult life that a man offered support without demanding my loyalty in exchange. And yet, even as this delicate, unfamiliar connection began to take shape, the shadow of my past lingered at the edges. I didn't seek it. It sought me. My ex, who had once walked away without looking back, seemed to reappear in the most unexpected places. I noticed him across the street one afternoon, watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Another time, he passed me in the lobby, his stare lingering too long on the boxes Ethan was carrying for me as we walked inside. His jaw tightened, his expression darkened, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes I had never seen before. Jealousy. He had never cared when he had me, but now that I wasn't his to return to, he cared too much. Ethan noticed the shift in my mood that evening as we shared a quiet moment outside the building. He didn't ask questions, didn't demand explanations, but he said something that tightened the breath in my chest. "You don't have to go backwards to prove you've grown," he murmured gently. "Some people only recognize your worth when they fear losing what they took for granted." His words felt like truth carved into stone. They lingered even after he walked away. That night, alone in my apartment, I thought about the contrast between the two men, one who used my loyalty as a cushion for his arrogance, and one who offered understanding without expectations. For the first time, I understood what healthy affection felt like. Not dramatic, not consuming, not a dizzying rush that left scars, but something rooted, peaceful, and kind. In the days that followed, my ex's presence grew more persistent. He appeared outside offices he had no business visiting. He lingered in hallways longer than necessary. He watched silently from distances that felt far too intentional. His jealousy sharpened into something bitter, something restless, something that looked nothing like remorse, and everything like entitlement resurfacing in its most dangerous form. I tried to ignore it. I tried to keep moving forward. But I should have known better. Men like him didn't simply walk away from power once they realized it no longer belonged to them. And I learned that lesson brutally the day I walked into a meeting with investors. investors who had praised my work, admired my discipline, and looked ready to support the biggest opportunity of my career. I sat down at the table, prepared to discuss the proposal I had spent months perfecting. But the moment the meeting began, something was off. One of the investors cleared his throat and slid a file across the table. "We received some concerning information," he said carefully. "About you." My heart dropped. Inside the folder were fabricated reports, twisted stories, deliberate attempts to destroy everything I had built. Someone had sabotaged me, and I knew exactly who had done it. As the room spun and the investors waited for my explanation, I realized my ex hadn't returned for love. He had returned to make sure that if he couldn't have me, then I wouldn't be able to rise without him. The moment I left the conference room, the weight of the sabotage pressed against my ribs with a suffocating heaviness that threatened to unravel every ounce of progress I had worked for. I could still feel the sting of the investors' disappointment in the stiff silence that followed their questions. Still hear the subtle doubt creeping into their voices as they flipped through pages of fabricated stories that twisted my credibility into something unrecognizable. For a moment, I felt myself collapse inward, not because I believed the lies, but because I understood exactly who crafted them, and I knew he had done it with a precision only someone intimately familiar with my past could execute. But before the panic could swallow me whole, a hand touched my shoulder. Steady, grounding, familiar. My mentor was standing there, his expression a mixture of quiet fury and unwavering belief. He asked nothing. He assumed nothing. He simply guided me to a private office, shut the door behind us, and demanded the truth in a tone that left no room for pretended strength. When I explained everything, my ex's return, his jealousy, the timing of his sudden reappearance, the manipulation buried beneath apologies, my mentor didn't respond with shock. He responded with resolve, with understanding, with the kind of support I hadn't known I deserved until I finally received it. "We're not letting him sink you," he said firmly, opening his laptop. "Not after everything you've built. Not now. Not ever." What I didn't expect was how quickly the people I had surrounded myself with, colleagues, friends, even quiet acquaintances, rose with him, each stepping forward with their own pieces of proof, emails, timestamps, character references, and professional records that contradicted every false accusation stacked against me. They didn't defend me because they pitied me. They defended me because I had earned respect through years of dedication, consistency, integrity, and growth. They defended me because, unlike the man who once tried to define my worth, they had actually witnessed it. The tide shifted faster than I imagined possible. My mentor arranged an emergency meeting with the investors, insisting they hear the full story, insisting the truth deserved space as much as the lies that had poisoned their perception. By evening, we were seated in the same room again. But this time I didn't enter as a frightened woman trying to outrun her past. I entered with my team beside me, evidence compiled meticulously, and a steadiness in my voice that belonged only to the woman I had become. When I spoke, I didn't appeal to sympathy. I didn't attempt to soften the story. I didn't try to hide the pain he caused or the ways I had allowed him to shrink me in the past. I simply laid out the truth, calmly, factually, powerfully, explaining the history, the emotional manipulation, the timing, the patterns of control he had displayed long before my success threatened his fragile ego. The more I spoke, the clearer the room became. The stronger my presence grew. The lies he crafted began to dissolve beneath the weight of undeniable truth. When the investors finally leaned back in their seats, no longer tense but reflective, one of them closed the folder of false reports with a slow, contemplative gesture. "We appreciate your honesty," he said, "and we appreciate your strength." The relief that washed over me wasn't loud or victorious. It was quiet, deep, almost sacred. It felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been stolen long before I even realized it was missing. But the day wasn't done with me yet. Just as I stepped into the hallway, preparing to breathe for the first time in hours, a commotion rose near the building entrance. Voices, footsteps, a familiar panic threading its way toward me. And when I rounded the corner, I found him. The man who once walked away when I had nothing. The man who returned only when he saw the glow of my success. The man who tried to sabotage the very future he had never believed I could build. He stood in the center of the lobby, pale, frantic, eyes wild with a mixture of fear and shame. Employees had begun to gather. Investors were watching. My mentor was near. And Ethan, quiet, steady Ethan, stood at the far end, eyes narrowed with a protectiveness I had never known from anyone before. And then, right there, in front of everyone, my ex dropped to his knees. Not with dignity, not with sincerity, but with the desperation of a man who feared losing control of the one thing he thought he still owned. His voice cracked through the stunned silence. "Please, forgive me. Please. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Every gaze in the lobby shifted to me. Every breath in the room held still. And as he begged for forgiveness beneath the eyes of everyone who had witnessed my transformation, I realized the next words out of my mouth would decide not just his future, but mine. The next morning, the echoes of his public desperation still clung to the halls of the building like a fading storm. The kind that leaves behind a strange, heavy quiet that no one quite knows how to step into. People avoided making eye contact, unsure whether to offer sympathy or space, but I felt neither shaken nor triumphant. Instead, I felt a stillness inside me, a clarity that had been missing for years. His kneeling had not healed anything, and it certainly hadn't broken me. It had only revealed how far I had come and how far he had fallen. Still, I knew I couldn't leave things suspended in the air like a frayed thread waiting to snap. Closure wasn't something I wanted, but something I needed if I ever hoped to walk fully into the life I was building. So I agreed to meet him one last time. We chose a quiet cafe on the edge of the city, a place where no one knew us, where the world wouldn't stop to watch the ending of a story they never understood. When he arrived, he looked smaller somehow. Shoulders slumped, eyes swollen with sleeplessness, hands trembling in ways he tried to hide beneath the table. The arrogance that once shielded him like polished armor had vanished, replaced by a fragile uncertainty that almost made him look like a stranger I barely recognized. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us like an unfinished confession. Eventually, he inhaled shakily and tried to offer a smile, but the guilt weighing down his expression made it collapse before it ever fully formed. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words tumbling out in a rush. "Not just for yesterday, for everything, for leaving you when you needed me, for treating you like you were less, for hurting you in every way I did. I don't know how I let myself become that person." His voice cracked, but I didn't rush to comfort him. I had done enough comforting in the years he stood untouched by the consequences of his actions. Instead, I let the moment settle, then spoke with the calm certainty of a woman who had finally learned her worth. "You didn't become that person," I said softly. "You always were. I just refused to see it because I loved the idea of who you could be, not the reality of who you chose to be." He flinched, but there was no cruelty in my tone. Only truth. A truth long overdue. "I broke apart when you left," I continued, my gaze steady. "I thought your abandonment meant I wasn't enough, that I was unlovable, forgettable, replaceable. I spent months believing I deserved the way you treated me, that my pain was a weakness instead of a wound that needed healing. But what you didn't realize when you walked away was that the pieces you left behind could be rebuilt into something stronger than what you ever bothered to know." His eyes shimmered with something between regret and disbelief. "I succeeded not because of you," I said, my voice quiet yet unwavering, but because you taught me exactly who I never wanted to be, and exactly what kind of love I would never accept again." He swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as though he couldn't bear the weight of the truth. "I know I messed up," he whispered. "But I've changed. I swear I've changed. If you give me another chance, just one, I'll spend the rest of my life making it right." The desperation in his eyes might once have broken me. Now it only saddened me. "Change isn't something you declare," I replied gently. "It's something you live, and you haven't lived it long enough for me to trust it." His breath trembled. "So that's it? I lose you forever?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't see the man I had loved or the man who had hurt me. I saw someone searching for redemption through the person he once broke. Someone trying to rebuild his life using mine as the foundation. Someone who wanted forgiveness not for healing, but for relief. And I realized then that closure wasn't about giving him peace. It was about giving myself freedom. I rose slowly, my chair sliding back with a soft scrape. He stood as well, panic flickering in his eyes, but I held up a hand to stop him. "You lost me the moment you decided I wasn't worth staying for," I said softly. "And I found myself the moment I stopped waiting for you to come back." His expression shattered, but for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for picking up the pieces. I turned toward the exit, feeling the weight of years lift from my shoulders as the door swung open. And as I stepped out into the bright afternoon light, I realized I had one final choice to make, one that would determine not just who I left behind, but who I was finally ready to walk toward. When I stepped out of the cafe and let the door close behind me, I felt the gentle warmth of the afternoon settle across my skin in a way that felt almost symbolic, as if the world itself was acknowledging the shift inside me, the soft but irreversible turn away from the life I had once been trapped in. The air tasted different, lighter, clearer, untouched by the shadows I had carried for so long. And as I walked down the quiet street, I felt the first true sense of peace I had experienced in years. It wasn't the kind of peace that comes from answers or apologies or promises. It was the deeper, quieter peace that grows only when you finally stop trying to save someone who was never willing to save you in return. For so long, I believed closure would come from him, from an apology, from regret, from the moment he finally understood what he had thrown away. But as I moved farther from the cafe, I realized closure was never meant to come from him at all. It was meant to come from me, from choosing myself in a way I had never been brave enough to choose before. I wasn't walking away from him. I was walking toward the version of myself I had spent years burying under the weight of someone else's indifference. The shift inside me became even clearer when I reached my building and stepped into the lobby. Ethan was there, waiting, not in a possessive way, not in a demanding way, but in a way that suggested he understood something significant had happened without needing the details. The moment his eyes met mine, a softness passed between us, a gentle recognition of the quiet storm I had just weathered. He didn't ask what happened. He didn't push for explanations. He simply offered presence, steady, grounded, patient. When I finally told him that I had let my past go for good, he didn't smile triumphantly or celebrate my decision. Instead, he nodded slowly, as though honoring a truth that was mine alone, and said words that settled into the deepest parts of me with quiet certainty. "I'm glad you chose yourself." It was the first time in years that someone acknowledged my worth without needing to compare it to anything or anyone else. In the weeks that followed, the world didn't suddenly become perfect, nor did healing arrive with a grand flourish. But something inside me softened. My laughter returned. Not the forced, polite kind I used to give to avoid conflict, but the real, unguarded laughter that springs from ease rather than fear. Conversations with Ethan became a gentle rhythm in my daily routine. The kind of connection that didn't consume me or demand sacrifice, but simply added warmth to places inside me I hadn't realized were still cold. He never rushed me, never pushed for more than I was ready to give, never made me feel like healing had a deadline. And in that spaciousness, affection unfolded not as an obligation or a test, but as something natural, a choice I was finally allowed to make freely. At work, I began to carry myself differently, not with the defensive sharpness of someone who had been mistreated, but with the confidence of someone who knew her own worth and no longer needed anyone to validate it. My mentor noticed the change. My team felt it, even. The investors who had once questioned me now admired the resilience that had shaped every part of my journey. I no longer walked into rooms wondering whether I belonged. I walked in knowing I did. Sometimes, late at night, when the city lights flickered beyond my window, I thought about the girl I used to be, the girl who waited for someone to choose her, the girl who mistook survival for loyalty, the girl who believed heartbreak was proof of devotion. I wanted to tell her she was stronger than she realized, that she deserved more than the crumbs she tried to build her future on, that one day she would rise so far beyond the pain she thought would define her. I wanted to tell her that the heartbreak she feared would destroy her was the very thing that carved space for the woman she would one day become. Ethan and I continued to grow. Not rushed, not fragile, not desperate, but steady, rooted, patient. He showed me what healthy affection looked like. Not control, not obsession, not grand apologies for broken promises, but the quiet consistency of someone who showed up because he wanted to, not because he feared losing something. With him, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel uncertain. I didn't feel like I needed to prove myself to be worthy of staying. I simply felt seen. And that, more than anything, taught me that the greatest transformation wasn't becoming someone impressive. It was becoming someone whole. As I stood on my balcony one evening, watching the city spread out beneath a sky painted with streaks of gold and lavender, I finally understood something I had spent years trying to learn. I hadn't become strong in spite of the heartbreak. I had become strong because of it. The girl he walked away from had shattered, yes, but the woman who rose from those pieces was someone he could never break again. And as I breathed in the quiet certainty of the life I was building, a question settled gently into my mind, one that felt less like fear and more like possibility. What if the person you needed to become was buried inside the heartbreak you survived? If this story touched your heart or reminded you of a moment you survived, tell me in the comments which part hit you the hardest. Your voice matters here.